She vanished with his unborn heir, after overhearing the Lycan king call her a pawn for the council. Sarah found out she was carrying his child on a Tuesday, in a cold stone room that smelled like dried lavender and old ink, and she told no one. Not the palace healer. Not the women who brought her breakfast each morning with careful eyes and careful mouths. Not the king himself, who had walked past her in the great corridor the evening before without slowing his steps, without glancing sideways, as though she were part of the wall, as though she were furniture that happened to breathe. She sat with the knowledge alone, pressed it flat inside her chest like a flower between book pages, and went back to her work. The work was translation. Treaties, border declarations, trade agreements written in 3 different languages that the court scribes could not read. Sarah could read all 3. This was the only reason she was here. She had always understood that. The only reason the council had agreed to King Aldrich's arrangement at all. She was useful. She was a tool with a talent, and tools did not need to be spoken to, only maintained. She had been in Aldrich's palace for 3 years. 3 years of quiet corridors and careful posture, of learning which rooms she was permitted to enter and which she was not, of eating her meals at a small table in the east wing that was neither the servants' hall nor the great dining room but somewhere in between, like a comma in a sentence, a pause that meant nothing on its own. The palace was enormous. It sat at the edge of the ashenwood forest, built from dark stone quarried in the northern mountains, with towers that caught the morning light and held it for a moment before letting it go. In winter the wind came through the gaps in the window frames, and Sarah had learned to stuff them with scraps of cloth. The servants noticed. None of them mentioned it to the king. She was not unhappy. She had decided, early on, that unhappiness was a luxury she could not afford, like silk slippers or warm baths without a reason. She had come here as part of a peace arrangement between the Lycan territories and the human settlements to the south. Her father had signed the papers. He had been pale when he did it, but he had signed them. She had stood beside him and watched the ink dry, and understood that her life had just been redirected, the way water is redirected when someone builds a dam. The water does not argue. It simply finds the new path and moves. She had found the new path. She had moved. Now she sat in the small east wing room with the dried lavender and the old ink, and a piece of knowledge she was not ready to share. And she worked on a trade agreement between the port cities and the northern lumber territories, and she kept her face very calm. The festival was in 4 days. The Autumn Moon Festival was the largest gathering the palace held each year. Every member of the High Council traveled to attend. Lords and ladies from the outer territories arrived in carriages and on horseback, bringing gifts and ambitions in equal measure. The great hall was decorated with lanterns and branches cut from the ashen wood, and there was music that began at sundown and continued until the moon was directly overhead. Sarah attended every year. She stood at the edges of the room in a dress the palace seamstress made for her, and smiled at the people who smiled at her, and answered questions about the translation work, and tried not to be too visible or too invisible, which was a careful balance she had spent 3 years learning. This year would be different. This year she was carrying a secret that changed the shape of everything around it, the way a stone changes the flow of water, and she was not yet ready to think about what came next. She put down her pen. Outside the window, the ashen wood was turning gold. The trees at the edge of the forest caught the autumn light and held it in their leaves, deep amber and burning red, and for a moment she just looked at them. She let herself look. She had a habit, in difficult moments, of finding one very specific physical thing to concentrate on. Not to escape the difficulty, but to stay grounded inside it. Right now it was the way one particular branch moved in the wind outside her window, a long, slow arc that returned to its starting position every time, patient as breathing. She watched it for a while. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. King Aldrich was not a cruel man. This was something Sarah had spent a great deal of time thinking about, because it mattered, and because it was complicated. He was not cruel. He was simply not aware of her in any way that counted. He ran his kingdom with efficiency, and with a coldness that the court read as strength, and that she read as something older than strength, something that had grown over a long time in a place that didn't allow for softness. She had seen him angry. She had seen him at the long table in the war room, when a border dispute erupted in the eastern territories, and he had been absolutely still while everyone around him raised their voices, and his stillness had been more frightening than any shouting. She had seen him in the training yard in the early mornings, when she walked past on her way to the East Wing library, moving through forms that no human body could have managed, too fast and too fluid, his breath barely changing. She had seen him tired, once, only once. After a 3-day negotiation that had ended badly, he had sat alone in the corridor outside the council chamber with his elbows on his knees and his face turned toward the floor, and she had walked past, and he had looked up, and for one moment, they had simply looked at each other. And then she had kept walking, and he had said nothing, and she had said nothing, and that had been that. He was not cruel. He was simply not present in her life in any way that required him to be kind. She had accepted this. She had accepted many things. But now she sat with this secret pressed inside her chest, and she thought about what it would mean, and the more she thought about it, the more she understood that the palace's version of things and her own version of things might not match at all. The morning of the festival, the palace transformed. Sarah watched it happen from her window and then from the corridor as she made her way to the library. Servants moved in organized streams carrying armfuls of lanterns, great branches of gold-leafed ashenwood, bolts of dark fabric for the high tables. The kitchens had been working since before dawn, and the smell reached every corridor. Bread and roasted meat and something sweet that might have been honey wine warming in a copper pot. The council members arrived in the afternoon. She heard them before she saw them. Voices in the main entrance hall, loud and certain in the way that people are loud when they are accustomed to being heard. She was on her way back from the library with a stack of reference books pressed against her chest, and she turned the corner into the upper gallery and looked down into the entrance hall and saw them below. 6 men and 2 women in traveling clothes that still managed to look expensive, and in the center of them, Aldrich. He was taller than she always remembered when she was not looking at him directly. He was speaking to the man on his left, a heavy-shouldered council member named Lord Carver, whose voice carried up to the gallery even when he was not trying to project. Aldrich was not smiling. He rarely smiled, but he was engaged, present. His body angled toward the conversation in a way it never quite angled when she was in the room. She watched for a moment, then she went back to her work. The festival that evening was everything it always was. The great hall glowed with the light of 100 lanterns hung at different heights from the ceiling, and the music from the far end of the room was good music, genuine and unhurried. Sarah wore the dress the seamstress had made, a deep blue-green that she had chosen herself from the fabric samples, one small choice that was actually hers. She stood near the tall windows with a cup of warm spiced cider that she was not drinking, and watched the room fill and move and breathe. Several people spoke to her, a lord from the Eastern Territories who wanted to know about the lumber trade agreement, one of the council women who asked polite questions about the translation work in a tone that suggested she found it quietly impressive but would not say so, a young man attached to one of the traveling households who had too much honey wine and wanted to know what it was like to live in the palace, as though it were an adventure. She answered each of them carefully. She kept her face pleasant and her posture relaxed, and inside her chest, the secret sat quiet and still, like a stone at the bottom of a river. Around the second hour of the festival, the noise in the hall reached a peak, and something in her body responded to it, the crowded warmth and the press of voices, with a wave of nausea so sudden and so complete that she had to set down her cup very carefully on the windowsill and breathe through it. She slipped out. The servants' corridor to the east wing was through a door beside the tall fireplace on the north wall, plain and unremarkable, and she had learned it years ago. She moved through it now quietly, into the cooler air of the back corridor, and breathed deeply, and felt the nausea begin to ease. She was moving slowly, one hand lightly on the stone wall, feeling the solidity of it under her fingers, when she heard Aldrich's voice. She stopped. The east corridor had strange acoustics. She had noticed it before, the way sound traveled along the stone walls from certain rooms, clear and close as though the speaker stood beside you. The door at the far end of the corridor, the one that led to the small council anteroom, must have been left partially open. The voices came through as cleanly as though she stood in the room itself. Aldrich's voice, and Lord Carver, and 2 others she recognized, older voices, council members whose names she had memorized months ago because it seemed important to know who the powerful people were. She should have kept walking. She stood very still instead. The Southern Territories are watching the arrangement carefully, Lord Carver was saying. His voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of a man who rarely said anything without knowing how it would land. They want to know it's more than symbolic. It has always been more than symbolic. That was Aldrich. She knew his voice without having to search for it. The translation work alone has produced 3 agreements that the previous court could not complete in 8 years. That is not what they are asking about. A pause. They want continuation. Permanence. The girl is young, healthy. If she produces an heir, it cements the treaty in a way that no document can. Silence from Aldrich. And if she does not, the older voice continued, the one she thought was Lord Fenwick, or if the arrangement proves insufficient, then we are positioned to replace her before the spring negotiations. Replace. The word went through her the way cold water goes through cloth, immediate and complete. She is useful in other ways, Aldrich said. His voice was even, controlled. I would not move to replace her without clear cause. But you would move, Carver, not asking. A pause, a beat that lasted too long. She is a pawn, Aldrich said. A well-kept one. She serves the purpose she was placed here to serve. Do not mistake my management of her comfort for sentiment. Sarah's hand was flat against the cold stone wall. She was not sure when she had pressed it there. She was not sure how long she had been standing in the corridor. She was counting her breaths the way she counted them when something very large was happening inside her, and she needed her body to stay still while her mind worked. A pawn. She said the word to herself in the silence of her own head, not with rage, not yet, with a kind of clear, clean recognition, like identifying an object in dim light and finally being certain of its shape. A pawn. A well-kept one. She pushed off the wall slowly. She straightened her back. She looked down the empty corridor ahead of her, at the far door that led to the east wing, to her room, to the small table where her work was stacked in neat piles. She thought about the baby, the quiet and certain fact of it. She thought about the word replace. She thought about her father signing the papers with his pale face and the ink drying while she watched. Then she began to walk, steady, unhurried. Her footsteps made almost no sound on the stone. She did not look back toward the door where the voices were still speaking. She had everything she needed to know. In her room she did not cry. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the window, at the dark ashenwood beyond the glass, at the moon that was rising enormous and amber above the tree line, and she thought very clearly and very carefully. She was not a woman given to panic. She was a woman given to looking at a problem directly, without decoration, and then deciding what to do. The problem, looked at directly, was this. She was here as a political arrangement, a piece placed on a board by men who thought in strategies rather than in lives. The child she was carrying would, if discovered, become another piece on the same board. An heir to be used, the same way she had been used, for the same kind of purpose she had overheard described in calm voices in a corridor. And when she was no longer convenient, or when a more convenient option presented itself, the word that would apply to her was replace. She had been here 3 years. She had been careful for 3 years. She was done being careful. She stood up. She crossed the room to the small chest at the foot of her bed, opened it, and looked at what was inside. The herbal kit she had been quietly assembling over the course of 18 months, purchasing items 1 or 2 at a time from the market traders who came to the palace gates each week. Dried herbs for illness and for healing. A small sharp knife with a bone handle, practical, not decorative. 3 bags of common coins she had saved with the disciplined patience of someone who had always suspected she might one day need them. Under these things, wrapped in plain cloth, was a small locked box. She took out the key from the chain she wore around her neck and opened it. Inside was a letter from her brother Owen, written 18 months ago, in which he had mentioned in passing that a village called Duskfen, at the edge of the human southern territories, had a new herbalist who was overwhelmed with patients and looking for an apprentice. He had mentioned it the way people mention small things in letters, not with intention, just as news. She had kept the letter. She had not known why, at the time, or perhaps she had known and had not allowed herself to examine the knowing. She wrapped the box back in its cloth. She looked around the room. There were things here that had been given to her. Gifts, or what the palace called gifts. A silver-handled brush, a set of books in matching covers, a small framed print of a map of the territories. Pretty things. Things chosen for her by someone who had been told she should have nice things because nice things were part of maintaining the arrangement. She left all of them. She took the herbal kit, the coins, the box, a cloak from the back of the door that belonged to the laundress and had been left here by mistake 2 weeks ago. Her own worn boots, good boots, chosen for walking, not for appearing in a great hall. She dressed carefully. She packed carefully. The palace at the deep middle of a festival night was nearly empty in its back corridors. The great hall was still full of music and voices and light. The kitchens were winding down. The back entrance through the larder was bolted from the inside, which meant it could be opened from the inside, which meant it was not a barrier. She opened it. She stepped out into the cold autumn night. The ashenwood was ahead of her, the great dark line of it, the amber moon hanging above the first trees. She stood for one moment in the night air and looked at it. Then she walked. 2 hours into the forest, when the lights of the palace were entirely gone, and there was only the moonlight coming through the trees in long pale lines, she allowed herself to feel it. Not panic, not grief. Something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. She placed one hand on her stomach, light as breath. "It is going to be all right," she said quietly. To herself, to the child, to the cold and patient forest around her. I know how to be careful. And I know how to be something other than careful now too. The trees said nothing. She walked on. Behind her, in the great hall of the palace, the music was still playing and the lanterns were still burning, and no one had yet noticed the small empty chair at the edge of the east wing table, the chair that was always occupied and that would not be occupied again. Not in the way they expected anyway. Not on any terms they had set. She walked for 3 days. The first day was the hardest, not because of the distance but because of the silence inside her head, which was not actually silence but a kind of roar she could not quiet. The voices from the corridor replaying themselves at unpredictable intervals, the particular evenness of Aldrich's tone, the way he had said it without a crack in his voice, without a breath of hesitation. A pawn, a well-kept one, as though he were describing a piece of furniture he had maintained carefully to protect its value. She kept walking. She had a direction, that was what mattered. The Ashenwood was not a safe forest. Everyone in the palace knew this, and said it frequently, in the same tone people use for things they want to sound dangerous, but secretly believe are exaggerated. Sarah, who had spent 3 years reading documents that included reports from the territory rangers, had a more specific understanding of what the forest contained. There were wolves. They were the kinds of territorial animals that did not like being surprised. There were sections of ground near the river bends that looked solid, and were not. She moved carefully. She stayed on the higher ground. She knew enough from the herbalist's notes she had been reading for 2 years to find the plants that were edible, and avoid the ones that were not. She slept for a few hours in the fork of a large tree on the first night, wedged into the angle of the branches, and she slept better than she had in months, which told her something about what the palace had been doing to her that she had been pretending not to notice. On the second day she reached the edge of the forest and the beginning of the open land that ran down toward the southern road. She stopped at the tree line and looked out at it, pale grass in the autumn light, hills rolling south toward a smear of distant buildings that might have been a market town. The road was visible as a brown line cutting through the grass, well used and clear. She stepped out of the trees. A traveling merchant gave her a ride in his cart for 6 hours, in exchange for helping him catalog his goods, which she did quickly and accurately, which impressed him enough that he also shared his midday meal without being asked. He was a cheerful man named Griffin, going south to sell preserved river fish to the market towns, and he talked almost continuously about fish prices and weather, and a horse he had once owned that he clearly missed deeply, and she was grateful for every word of it because it kept her own head quiet. In the late afternoon he turned west at a crossroads and she climbed down and thanked him, and watched the cart move away, and then she was on the road alone again. By the third day she was in the southern territories, and the air smelled different, less pine and stone, more open, like earth recently turned. She passed through 2 small villages, bought bread and a piece of hard cheese from a market stall with her coin, asked a woman filling a water barrel if she knew the direction to Duskfen. The woman pointed south and slightly east. "Half a day's walking," she said. The child in her womb made itself known with a faint flutter that morning, the first time she had felt it clearly, and she stopped in the middle of the road and put her hand over the spot and stood very still, and a man driving a cart of hay had to call out to her before she stepped aside. "Sorry," she said, and moved to the edge of the road, and kept walking. Duskfen was smaller than she had imagined. Most things were, when you arrived at them after anticipating them for a long time. It was a village of perhaps 300 people, maybe slightly more, set at the edge of a slow river with a mill on one side and a modest market square on the other. The buildings were mostly stone and timber, practical, not decorative. There was a blacksmith and a baker and a place that appeared to be both a tavern and a gathering hall, and at the far end of the main lane, a small building with dried herbs hanging in bundles outside the door. Sarah stood in front of it and read the small painted sign. Edna Carr, herbalist and healer. She knocked. The woman who answered was very old, very short, and looked at Sarah with eyes that were extraordinarily alert for someone who appeared to be at least 70 years past any patience for nonsense. She looked at Sarah's face. She looked at the cloak. She looked at the very obvious state of Sarah's condition, which at 2 months was not yet dramatic, but was, to a practiced eye, not subtle either. She said nothing for a moment. Then she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "You look like someone who has been walking for days and is trying not to admit it." 3 days, Sarah said. "Sit down before you fall down," the old woman said, and turned back into the room. Sarah sat. The inside of the herbalist's cottage was a comfortable chaos of organized knowledge, shelves packed with labeled jars, bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling beams, A work table covered in the organized debris of someone who was always in the middle of several things at once. It smelled sharp and green and medicinal and alive in a way that the palace had never smelled. Edna put a pot on the small fire and made tea in the particular way of someone who had been making tea for a very long time and had strong opinions about it. She brought 2 cups to the table, set one in front of Sarah, and sat down across from her. "Name," she said. Sarah had thought about this. She had thought about it for 2 of the 3 walking days. She had decided. "Claire," she said. Edna looked at her steadily. "Claire." "Yes." The old woman picked up her tea. "And your husband?" "He died," Sarah said. "In the border troubles, near the Eastern Territories." Edna looked at her again, with those extremely alert eyes, and Sarah had the uncomfortable sensation of being read more accurately than she had intended. "I see," Edna said, which might have meant she believed it, or might have meant exactly the opposite. "And what brings you to Duskfen, Claire?" "I read that you were looking for an apprentice," Sarah said. "I have some knowledge of herbs. I learn quickly. I am not afraid of long hours, and I will not complain about difficult work." Edna set down her cup. She looked at the hands Sarah had placed flat on the table, which were ink-stained in the way that people's hands are when they have spent years writing, and could not fully remove the evidence even with travel and 3 days of outdoor living. "Herbs," Edna said. "Among other things," Sarah said carefully. "What else?" "Languages. I can read and write in several. I can keep records, manage accounts, draft correspondence." Edna was quiet for a moment. The fire made a small sound. Outside, someone in the village called out to someone else, an ordinary sound of ordinary life continuing. "You are educated," Edna said. "Yes." "Beyond what a merchant's daughter would be." Sarah said nothing. Edna picked up her tea again. "Well," she said after a long moment, "I do have more patience than I can sensibly manage, and my hands are not as steady as they were, and someone needs to keep the record books because my writing has become illegible even to me." She looked at Sarah directly. "The room in the back is small. There is a proper bed and enough space for what you'll need. The work is hard and the pay is not much, but it is reliable, and Duskfen is a quiet place." She paused. "Quiet is what you need, I think," she added. It was not a question. "Yes," Sarah said, "it is." Edna nodded once, definitively, as though the matter were settled, which it apparently was. She stood up and went back to her fire and said, without turning around, "Finish your tea and I'll show you the room. You can start tomorrow morning, assuming you're recovered enough from whatever walking you've been doing. You look like you walked through the whole of the Ashenwood." "Most of it," Sarah said. The old woman made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow will come fast." Sarah drank her tea. The room was small. The bed was narrow and the blanket was wool and slightly scratchy, and the window looked out onto the river, which caught the evening light and turned it silver. Sarah lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing at all. That was the first night she had slept without dreaming about the corridor, about the stone wall under her hand, about the precise evenness of a voice saying things that she was not supposed to have heard. She slept for 10 hours. The weeks that followed had a texture that was entirely new to her. She had always been a quick learner. She had learned 3 languages before she was 16, had taught herself to read the legal forms of 2 of them without a teacher, had absorbed the political vocabulary of Aldrich's court within 6 months of arriving there. She learned Edna's system with the same focused attention she had given everything else, and Edna, who had been quietly uncertain about her at first, began to relax as the weeks passed. The village's people were cautious with her at first, which she expected. A newcomer with a dead husband and a growing belly, and clearly more education than a woman in her stated situation would typically have, was an interesting puzzle to a small community, and small communities tended to rotate interesting puzzles for a while before accepting them. She did not push. She learned names. She remembered details. She asked questions about the village with genuine interest because she found, to her own surprise, that she was genuinely interested. The history of the mill, the families who had been here for 3 generations, the way the river flooded in early spring every year and the specific measures the village took to protect against it, the fact that the baker's daughter was brilliant at numbers and should have been educated differently and hadn't been because of the usual reasons. Edna watched her absorb all of this with the expressionless satisfaction of a very old person watching a competent young one finding their feet. One evening in November, sitting at the work table cataloging new stock by lamplight, Edna said without preamble, "You were not a merchant's daughter." Sarah kept her eyes on the jar she was labeling. "No," she said. "You were someone's wife," Edna said. "Or close enough to it. Someone with a large household and resources. Sarah was quiet. You are safe here, Edna said. That is not me asking questions. That is me telling you that Duskfen does not turn people over to whoever comes looking, as a general rule. We have done it before and we know how to do it again. Sarah put down the jar and looked at the old woman. Someone may come looking, she said. I assumed so, Edna said. A woman who walks through the Ashenwood alone in autumn, rather than take the road, usually has a reason for avoiding the road. She picked up her own work again. We'll manage when we get to it. In the meantime, eat more. You are not eating enough. Sarah looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said. Unnecessary, Edna said. Label the rest of those jars before the lamp burns low. Sarah picked up the next jar and started writing. By December she had become, in the quiet accumulation of daily things, part of Duskfen's life, not at the center of it. She was not someone who pushed to the center of things, but woven in at the edges in the way that useful people get woven into communities without making a great effort of it. She knew which families had children with recurring fevers and which elder needed the joint remedy every 2 weeks without being reminded, and which farmer's wife had been quietly struggling with something that was not entirely physical and needed to be listened to before she could be helped. She had cut her hair in late October, short at the sides, a practical decision she had been considering for years and had never made because the palace seamstress had always maintained a gentle and persistent opinion about how she should look. She had made the cut herself with the small sharp knife from her kit, and had looked at herself in the river's reflection afterward, and felt something shift in her chest that was quiet and settled and clean. She was Claire in Duskfen, Claire who was learning the herbs and keeping Edna's records and was expecting a baby in the late winter. The village did not ask too many questions. The village brought her soup when it was cold and included her in the market day conversation and let her be what she had decided to be, which was a woman making a different life with the materials she had available. The child moved often now. She talked to the baby sometimes, in the evenings when the cottage was quiet and the fire was low, not in full sentences but in small observations, the sound of the river, the particular quality of the winter light in the mornings, the way Edna scolded the cat for sitting on the medicinal jars with complete ineffectiveness because the cat paid no attention and neither of them really expected it to. Small things, the texture of an ordinary life. She was 3 months into this life when the first snow came to Duskfen, and she stood at the cottage door in the early morning and watched it fall and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had never in her adult life felt this particular feeling, which was the feeling of being somewhere because she had chosen it. Not arranged, not placed, not maintained. Chosen. She held on to that the way she had held on to the branch outside her window in the palace, watching it arc and return, patient as breathing. The snow fell. The baby moved. She went inside and started the morning fire. Back in the palace, though she did not know it yet, a room had been searched for the second time in 2 weeks. A small locked box that should have been under a floorboard was no longer there. A row of gifts sat on a bed no one had slept in. A king had looked at those gifts for a long time before he spoke, but that was happening somewhere else entirely. Here, in Duskfen, the fire caught, and the cottage filled with warmth, and outside, the snow went on falling in the patient, indifferent way of winter, covering everything old with something new, and giving the world, for a little while, a surface that had not yet been walked on. The palace notice came on a gray morning in October, 11 days after Sarah had not appeared at the morning work session, had not appeared at the midday meal, had not appeared anywhere, had simply ceased to be present in any room that anyone entered. Aldrich learned of it at the 4th hour. He was in the war room with his beta, Kale, reviewing the winter patrol assignments for the northern border, when one of the senior servants knocked and entered and said, with the careful tone of someone delivering news they were not certain how to classify, that the ward had not been seen since the previous evening. Aldrich looked up from the maps. Since the festival, Kale said. He was standing at the window, and he said it in the particular flat way he said things when he was withholding a great deal more. Since the festival, the servant confirmed. Aldrich set down his pen. Her room, he said. We have checked the room, my lord. Her working materials are present, her documents, several gifts that had been placed on the bed. Her personal effects are not entirely clear, but the healer's kit she kept in the east wing chest is not there, and the chest, Aldrich said. A pause. The floor panel beneath the chest, the servant said carefully. It has been opened. Whatever was inside it is not there now. The room was quiet. Kale was still looking at the window. When you say gifts, Aldrich said. The servant said nothing for a moment. They were arranged on the bed, he said at last. In a row. Aldrich stood up from the table. He moved to the window, not next to Cale but near him, and looked out at the courtyard below, where 2 stable hands were going about the morning work in the thin October light, perfectly unaware that anything in the palace had shifted. He stood there for a long time. "Send search parties to the Ashenwood," he said. "Northern and eastern edges first. Alert the gate road watchers for a description. Send a quiet message to the southern road posts to watch for a woman traveling alone." "Yes, my lord. And if she is found?" He did not answer that immediately. "Inform me," he said. "Before any action is taken, inform me first." The servant left. The door closed. Cale did not move from the window. After a moment, without turning, he said, "She heard." Aldrich said nothing. "The corridor by the East Hall has the acoustic fault. It has always had it. The council meeting was held in the anteroom." Cale paused. "If she was in that corridor at any point during the meeting, she would have heard," Aldrich said. "Yes." Silence. Aldrich looked at the courtyard. One of the stable hands dropped a bucket, and the sound rang out clearly across the stone, and then the quiet returned. "She left her gifts in a row," he said. It was not a question, and not quite a statement. It landed somewhere between the two. "Yes," Cale said. Another silence. "Find her," Aldrich said. "We are looking," Cale said. "The Ashenwood is large. If she went through it directly, rather than taking the road, the search will take time." "Then it will take time," Aldrich said. He turned from the window and went back to the map table. He looked at the patrol assignments. He did not pick up his pen. After a moment, he pushed the maps aside and stood with his hands flat on the empty surface of the table, and the thing he was doing was not looking at anything in the room. Cale watched him from the window. He said nothing. He knew Aldrich well enough to know when silence was the only useful offering. The days that followed had a specific quality that the palace registered without naming. The king was present. He attended every meeting. He reviewed every document set before him. He made decisions that were, by every measure, correct. He was not short-tempered. He was not visibly distracted. He was, in all observable ways, exactly as he always was. But Cale, who had been Aldrich's beta for 11 years, noticed the small things. The way Aldrich's head turned when a door opened, a fraction of a second before it should. The reflex of a man waiting for something to arrive. The fact that the daily work reports from the East Wing translation desk were still being sent to Aldrich's table even after the obvious conclusion that they would no longer be filled, as though someone had forgotten to cancel the habit, as though someone had not wanted to cancel it. The search parties returned without useful information. A tracking scout found marks in the Ashenwood that might have been a single person moving south, but the autumn leaves on the ground made it uncertain, and the trail went cold 2 days south of the tree line, where the land became drier and gave no impressions. The road watchers had seen a woman matching a general description some weeks earlier, traveling south on a merchant's cart. But the merchant had long since moved on and the woman with him, and the road watchers had not thought to stop the cart because there had been nothing alarming in what they saw. A woman on a trader's cart was ordinary. She had been invisible in the most perfect way, by looking like exactly what she had always been made to feel she was, ordinary, unworthy of a second look. Aldrich read the road watcher's report twice. He set it down and looked at the far wall of his office for a considerable time. It was in the 4th week of November that Cale said what he had been not saying. They were in Aldrich's private office late in the evening, the fire burning low, the desk between them covered in reports that had been read and not filed, which was unlike Aldrich, whose office was normally extremely ordered. "You should tell the council you are concerned about her safety," Cale said. "I am concerned about her safety," Aldrich said. "I know," Cale said. "I mean, you should say so, directly, to the people who heard what she heard." Aldrich looked at him. "It would serve 2 purposes," Cale continued, in the even tone he used when he was making a case he expected to meet resistance. "The council will think you are managing the situation politically, and you will have said the honest thing without anyone knowing it was the honest thing." Aldrich was quiet. "She heard everything," Aldrich said. "Yes, word for word." "Almost certainly, given the acoustics. She went through the Ashenwood alone," Aldrich said. "At night, in October." "Yes," Cale said. Something crossed Aldrich's face that was not an expression he showed often. It was not guilt in any simple form, and it was not only worry, it was something that sat underneath both of those things, something that had been sitting there for weeks, and that he had been conducting the business of his kingdom right on top of, methodically, because that was what he knew how to do. "She planned it," he said. The healer's kit, the loose floorboard. She had been planning it. Yes, Cale said. It appears so. A long silence. For how long? Aldrich said quietly. It was not a question to Cale. Cale did not answer it. Aldrich stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark courtyard and the dark ashenwood beyond the palace walls, the trees barely visible in the moonless night, just the suggestion of them, the shape of a large dark presence that had swallowed the trail of someone who had decided, very quietly and very deliberately, that she was done. He thought about 3 years of morning corridors, the East Wing table, the ink-stained hands on the treaty documents, the one time, outside the council chamber, when they had looked at each other in the corridor with no one else around, and he had said nothing, and she had kept walking, and he had told himself it was the right management of the arrangement. He thought about the gifts in a row on the bed. He had not allowed himself to think about the gifts in a row until now. He had been keeping that image behind other things, behind reports and patrol assignments and the work of a kingdom, and now at midnight in his cold office with the fire gone low, he let himself look at it directly. She had arranged them with intention, that was the thing. She had not swept them aside in anger, had not left them scattered, had not done anything that suggested heat or haste. She had placed them in a row, deliberately, the way you conclude a sentence. He turned from the window. Expand the search south, he said. I want scouts along every road toward the human territories. I want word sent to the village settlement heads along the southern belt, quietly, no announcement, just awareness. And if they find her, Cale said. Aldrich looked at him. Tell them to send word to me, before anything else. No action, no engagement, no contact. Just a location. He paused. She is not to be frightened. She is not to be made to feel cornered. Whoever finds her keeps their distance and sends word, and that is all. Cale looked at him for a long moment. Understood, he said. After Cale left, Aldrich stood in his office alone for a long time. He was not a man who spent time examining what he felt about things. He had been taught by years and by circumstance and by the particular demands of a kingdom that required a certain kind of leadership to examine what things meant strategically and then to act on the strategy. Feeling had been, for a long time, something that happened in rooms he did not enter. But the room was open now. She had been in his palace for 3 years, and he had known, in the careful peripheral way that people know things they do not wish to examine, that she was more than what the council's language called her. He had seen her in the East Wing library at 6 in the morning, reading documents she was not required to read, purely for interest. He had read her translation notes, which contained, in careful small handwriting in the margins, her own observations about the political subtext of the agreements she was translating, observations that were frequently more perceptive than anything the council had produced. He had said nothing about the observations. He had simply read them, and kept reading them, and said nothing. He had not said anything because saying something would have required him to know what to say, and he had not known, and the arrangement had seemed easier to maintain than to examine. He was examining it now. He crossed to the desk and picked up the patrol assignments he had been ignoring. He set them down again. He thought about the ashenwood at night, a woman alone, the cold of October already sharp in the mornings, dropping further at night. He thought about the things she had taken, measured against the things she had left, the precision of it, the planning of it, months of it perhaps, building a path quietly while everyone around her looked through her as though she were a window. He had looked through her as though she were a window. He sat down at his desk. He pulled a blank sheet of paper toward him. He held the pen and looked at it and then set it down without writing anything, because there was no document for this, no form for what he was trying to compose, and he did not yet have the words. He would find her. He was completely certain he would find her. What he was less certain about, in the specific and uncomfortable way of someone standing at the edge of a problem they have never had before, was what he would say when he did. He sat in his cold office until the first gray light of morning came through the window, and he did not sleep, and he did not stop thinking. And outside the palace the winter was moving in across the open land to the south, over the roads and the rivers and the small villages, over a place called Duskfen that he could not yet find on any map but that was out there somewhere, waiting for him to be the kind of man who deserved to find it. He was not sure, yet, that he was that man. He was going to have to become it. The search went on. Outside his window, the sky turned from black to the particular pale gray of a winter morning, and the ashenwood stood still and dark and gave nothing away. And somewhere in the human territories a woman who had once translated his treaties was learning a new language entirely. one made of river light and dried herbs and the small, insistent presence of a life growing inside her, and she was not waiting to be found. She was simply living, which was, in its own quiet way, the most complete refusal of everything she had left behind. The winter came to Duskfen without announcement, as winters do in places that have been living with them long enough to stop being surprised. One morning the river had a skin of ice along its edges, thin as paper, and by the following week the ground was hard and the sky had turned the low white color that meant more was coming. Sarah was 5 months along by then. The pregnancy had stopped being a private fact and become a visible one, obvious to anyone who looked at her, which meant the entire village of Duskfen had been watching it develop with the warmly proprietorial interest that small communities bring to any new arrival, even one that had not yet arrived. The miller's wife brought her a knitted blanket in the first week of December. The baker pressed an extra loaf into her hands at least twice a week without charging her for it. 3 women of varying ages appeared at the cottage door on a Tuesday evening in January, with the stated purpose of visiting Edna, and the actual purpose of looking at Sarah and offering their combined wisdom on the subject of pregnancy, which was extensive and occasionally contradictory, and delivered with complete confidence throughout. Sarah sat and listened and asked questions and felt, in a way she could not entirely account for, taken care of. It was not a feeling she was practiced in. She was used to being useful. She was used to being managed. She was used to being the person who maintained the careful balance, who kept her face pleasant and her voice level and her presence as undemanding as possible. Being taken care of required something different. It required her to allow it. She was learning. Edna watched this process with her usual expressionless satisfaction. The herbalist's cottage had settled into a rhythm that suited them both. Sarah handled the record books, the patient correspondence, the inventory of supplies. She prepared the simpler remedies under Edna's supervision, and several of the more complex ones as her training deepened. She talked to the patients in a way that Edna, who was excellent at diagnosis and brisk at bedside manner, was not always inclined to. She remembered the names of their children and the details of their previous complaints, and which elder preferred to be asked how he was before she examined him, and which mother needed to be told things twice before they landed, because she was always half distracted with worry. These were not things she had been trained to do. They were things she had done, for years, in the palace corridors, navigating the court with the careful attention of someone who could not afford to miss the small signals. And now she was doing them in a different key, for a different purpose, and the purpose was simply this. The person in front of her was a person who needed something, and she could help. She found she had been wanting to do this for a very long time without knowing what it was she wanted. In the evenings she sewed. She had purchased fabric at the market with her coins, plain cotton in cream and pale gray, and she was making small clothes with the focused patience that she had always brought to difficult work. She was not naturally gifted with a needle the way some women were. The stitches required more attention than she would have liked, but attention was something she had in supply, and the clothes were coming out neat and serviceable and hers, made with her own hands for a child who would be hers in a way that nothing had ever entirely been hers before. Edna watched her sewing one evening and said, "You were a lady." Sarah kept her eyes on the seam she was working. "Edna." "Not accusing," Edna said, "observing. Your posture, the way you speak to people, the education, the way you are learning the herb work, which is fast, faster than anyone I have taken on in 40 years, which means you have a trained mind, a mind that has been educated at some expense." She paused. "A lady. Does it matter?" Sarah said. "Not to Duskfen," Edna said. "I told you that, I meant it." She picked up the cat, which had been attempting to sit on the sewing fabric, and placed it firmly on the floor. "It might matter to whoever you left behind, whether they consider you still theirs." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I was considered a ward," she said carefully. "A political arrangement, not exactly a lady, not exactly anything they had a clean word for." Edna looked at her. "An arrangement," the old woman repeated. "Yes. With someone powerful." "Yes." Edna picked up her tea. "Is the child his?" Sarah met her eyes. "Yes," she said. The fire made its small sound. Outside the window, the wind moved against the cottage walls with the particular low sound of a cold night. "And he does not know," Edna said. "No. And you do not intend him to." Sarah looked at the small garment in her hands, the cream fabric, the careful stitches. She thought about what she intended, which was not always the same as what would happen. "I intend," she said slowly, "for this child to be mine first, to be a person, not a piece in someone else's arrangement. Whatever else happens, that is what I intend." Edna said nothing for a moment. "Good," she said then, simply, and drank her tea. They sat in the warm cottage with the fire and the wind and the quiet between them, and the cat eventually climbed back onto the sewing fabric and had to be removed again. And Sarah finished the seam and started the next one, and the evening passed the way evenings do in places where ordinary life is allowed to go on being ordinary. She woke in the night sometimes and lay in the dark listening to the river. Not with fear exactly. Something more complicated. A kind of alertness that she had trained herself out of in the palace but that had come back here, quieter and less anxious than it used to be. More like a watchfulness than a worry. She thought about the search parties. She was not naive enough to believe there were no search parties. She had spent 3 years reading intelligence documents and she understood how a king's resources worked. But the southern territories were large. Duskfen was small. And she had not taken the road. She had been invisible in the palace for 3 years. Invisibility was a skill, and she had it, and she had used it to walk out a larder door and disappear into a forest and emerge as someone else entirely. And the people of Duskfen had accepted Claire the herbalist's apprentice with the unceremonious practicality of people who cared more about whether you showed up for work than about the story behind you. She was as safe as she could make herself. She settled for that and went back to sleep. In January, a young woman came to the cottage in considerable distress about a difficult pregnancy, and Sarah spent 4 hours with her working through the problem, which turned out to be manageable with the right preparation and some extremely specific instructions that Sarah wrote out in her clear handwriting and made the woman promise to follow. When the young woman left, tearful with relief, Edna looked at Sarah with an expression that was, for Edna, practically warm. "You have a gift for this," she said. "I have a need to be useful," Sarah said. "That is not the same thing," Edna said. "Being useful is a skill. What you did this afternoon was something else. You made her feel that she was not facing it alone. That is not a skill you can learn." She turned back to her work. "It is a thing people either have or they do not. You have it." Sarah looked at the door the young woman had gone through. She thought about 3 years of being carefully useful in a place where useful was the only thing she was permitted to be. She thought about what it felt like to be useful now, in this small cottage in this small village, where it was her choice, and her knowledge, and her care, and no one had arranged for her to be here. She thought about what she had said to the baby. In the evenings, the river sound, the winter light, the ordinary texture of a chosen life. "Thank you," she said. Edna waved a hand dismissively and said nothing more, which was the Edna equivalent of a long and sincere reply. February came. The baby was due in late February or early March, and as the time approached, Sarah felt the weight of the specific and practical, which was familiar territory. She prepared. She read everything available on the subject. She had 3 long conversations with Edna about the process and what to expect and what to watch for and what to do in each possible circumstance, because knowing the specific things was how she managed the large and shapeless fears. The village women helped without being asked to help and without making much ceremony of it. They appeared with things she needed before she thought to ask. They offered knowledge freely. They arranged a rotation so that someone would be close at hand when the time came. As she was, she realized, surrounded. Not in the way the palace had surrounded her, which was a form of enclosure, but in the way that people surround each other when they have decided that someone is theirs to look after, which is a form of belonging. She had not expected to belong to any place again so quickly. She had not expected to belong to any place she had chosen, ever. She was not sure she had words for what that felt like. She was working on finding them. On a Tuesday in early February, when the river ice was beginning to thin at the edges and the afternoons were getting longer by the small, precise measures that mean spring is somewhere in the distance even when you cannot see it, a horseman came through Duskfen. He was not looking for anything obvious. He stopped at the tavern and asked general questions about the village, the kind of questions travelers ask. He bought a meal and ate it, and looked around in the casual way of someone who was not trying to look around. Edna mentioned it to Sarah that evening. She said it with the flatness of someone recording a fact, not raising an alarm. Sarah was quiet. "Did he ask about newcomers?" she said. "He asked about the village in general," Edna said. "He mentioned that he was looking for a woman, in passing. A woman who might be traveling alone and with child. He described her as someone whose family was looking for her." Sarah looked at the fire. "He moved on," Edna said. "East, toward the other settlements." "Today," Sarah said. "Today," Edna confirmed. They were quiet for a moment. "He will circle back," Sarah said. "Or send word." "Possibly," Edna said. "Or he will not. Villages in this territory do not give out information about their residents as a general habit." He asked the tavern keeper. The tavern keeper is not a man who remembers faces he has not been paid to remember. Sarah was still looking at the fire. The baby moved, a strong rolling movement, the kind that had become familiar over the past months, the specific and certain evidence of a life deciding its own directions. She put her hand over the spot. "He will find us eventually," she said, "or someone will." "Eventually," Edna agreed. "You have time." "Time for what?" Sarah said. "Time to decide what you are going to do when it happens," Edna said. "You have been deciding a great many things since you came here. This is one more." She picked up her knitting, which she did in the evenings when her hands were tired from the day's work, and the needles began their small, steady sound. Sarah sat with her hand on her stomach and looked at the fire and thought about decisions. She had been making them since October, small ones and large ones. The hair, the name, the room, the work, the village. The slow building of a life from the materials of a place she had chosen. She had been doing this without certainty, without knowing how it would resolve, without a map for this particular territory. She had done it anyway. This was one more thing to do anyway. She did not know yet what the right thing to do was when the finding came. She was honest enough with herself to know that she had not solved this, only delayed it, and that delay had given her 5 months and a winter, and the knowledge of what it felt like to be somewhere because you chose it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She settled further into her chair and felt the fire's warmth and listened to the knitting needles and the river outside and thought, with the clear, unhurried quality of someone who has learned to think this way in a place that allows for it, about what came next. She did not panic. She planned. That was what she did. And somewhere in the plan, growing at its center like the steady, unignorable fact it was the knowledge that she would not be afraid of whatever came through the door, because she had walked through a forest alone in October, and arrived somewhere new, and built something that was hers, and the woman who could do that was not the same woman who had stood in a corridor with her hand flat against the cold stone. That woman was gone. This one was still deciding what she was becoming. But she was not afraid. That was new. That was entirely new. Outside, the first sound of late winter came in the wind against the windows, cold still, but different now, carrying something underneath the cold that was not quite warmth yet but was the direction of warmth. The promise of a turning that was coming whether or not anyone was ready for it. The fire burned. The needles clicked. The baby moved. She sat and breathed and planned. The letter from the Eastern Road Post reached Aldrich on a Wednesday in late February, written in the plain code he had specified for any correspondence related to the search. He read it at his desk. Then he read it again. The letter said, "A village called Duskfen, southeast of the main human settlement road. Population small. A woman matching the description residing with the local herbalist. Circumstance apparent. Recommended quiet confirmation before approach." Recommended quiet confirmation before approach. He had written those instructions himself. He recognized the phrasing. He had not thought, when he wrote them, about what it would feel like to read them. He set the letter down. He sat for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a long time, and has just received the thing they were waiting for, and is now required to determine what to do with it. He went to find Cale. Cale read the letter without expression and handed it back. "When do you want to leave?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," Aldrich said. "How many?" Aldrich thought about this carefully, in the way he thought about tactical decisions, which was the only framework he had that was reliable. Size of approach, speed of movement, presentation. She had been frightened, or not frightened, she did not frighten easily. She had been something that caused her to walk through a forest alone at night, rather than face whatever she feared would happen if she stayed. He thought about that. He thought about what approach would communicate. 6 riders, he said. Not in court colors. Scale looked at him. "Plain travel clothes," Aldrich said. "We stop at the village as travelers. We do not announce. And when you see her," Scale said. "That is between me and her," Aldrich said. Scale said nothing for a moment. Then, "She is 5 months along." "I know," Aldrich said. "The timing would have been—" "I know," Aldrich said. A silence. "All right," Cale said. He folded his hands on the table and looked at his king, and what he was doing was the thing he had been doing for 11 years, which was watching very carefully and saying very little, and drawing the kind of conclusions that only people who watch carefully can draw. "She is going to be angry," Cale said. Aldrich looked at him. "I know," he said, for the 3rd time, with a weight to it that was not dismissal but something closer to reckoning. They left the next morning at dawn. The ride south took 3 days, longer than necessary because Aldrich held the pace deliberately, which was not like him. Cale noticed. He did not comment. There was a mood around the king that was not hesitation and was not quite preparation. It was the specific interior state of a man who knows where he is going, and is using the time before arrival to become whatever version of himself he intends to be when he gets there, which in Aldrich's case required more time than most things, because he was, by nature and by training, not a man who reconfigured himself easily. They crossed the border into the human southern territories on the second afternoon. The land was different here, flatter, more open, the sky wider, without the northern stone and the dark ashenwood pressing at the edges. Small farmsteads, villages at intervals on the plain, each with its own character. Children watching from fence posts as they rode past. Dogs who announced them briefly and then lost interest. On the third day, mid-afternoon, they came over a low hill, and Duskfen was below them. The river, the mill, the market square, the ordinary architecture of a life that knew what it was and did not require anything more than that. Aldrich stopped at the top of the hill. The six of them spread out slightly in the natural way of horses breathing, and they all looked down at the village in the thin winter afternoon light. Cale said nothing. Aldrich looked at the village for a long moment. There, he said, at the far end of the lane, a small building with dried herbs in bundles at the door. He did not know how he knew. He could not have explained, if asked, the specific quality of knowing. But he looked at that door for a long time, and then he urged his horse forward, and they rode down into the village. They left the horses at the small tavern stable, and Aldrich walked alone down the lane toward the herbalist's cottage, leaving Cale and the others with the clear, silent instruction that they would stay where they were. The market square was mid-afternoon quiet. A few people were about. A woman with a basket, an elderly man sitting outside the baker's with something in a paper wrapping, 2 children chasing something that appeared to be a determined chicken. Aldrich moved through it with the deliberate reduction of his own presence that he knew how to do when he needed to. His height was always a problem in this regard. He could not make himself shorter, but he could move with less gravity, less forward intention, and he did so now. He was halfway down the lane when he saw her. She was at the market stall near the end of the row, the one selling winter root vegetables, and she was standing with a cloth bag open over one arm, examining something, a parsnip or a turnip, with the focused attention she had always brought to small, immediate things. Her hair was different. She was wearing a plain dark cloak that was not hers originally. He could tell by the way it sat on her, and she was obviously very pregnant, obviously and completely and unmistakably carrying his child, and the sight of it went through him in a way he had not prepared for, in the way you do not prepare for things that take the breath directly. He stopped walking. She had not seen him yet. She was speaking to the market seller, a coin changing hands, the ordinary transaction of a life that had decided it was ordinary and was making it stick through sheer consistency. He thought, in the moment before she looked up, about what he had said in the council anteroom. He heard it the way she must have heard it, through stone and silence, arriving whole and unavoidable. A pawn, a well-kept one. He heard it differently now. He had been hearing it differently for 4 months, but there was a difference between hearing something at a distance and standing in the cold of a village market, with the evidence of what it had cost directly in front of you. She looked up. Their eyes met from 30 feet apart in a quiet village lane in February, with the winter light flat and even above them, and the sound of the market going about its business all around, and Aldrich held the gaze and did not look away. Her face did nothing dramatic. That was the first thing. He had been bracing, he realized, without knowing he had been bracing, for something. Alarm. Retreat. Any of the responses a person might have to an unexpected encounter with someone they had walked out of a forest to escape. Her face did not do any of those things. What it did instead was something quieter and harder to name. A recognition, not startled, as though she had been waiting for this moment, and had used the waiting well. A kind of composure that was not distance, it was present, and clear-eyed, and entirely intentional. She closed the cloth bag. She turned back to the market seller for a single additional word, unhurried. And then she picked up the bag and walked toward the cottage at the end of the lane. Not away from him, not toward him, somewhere else entirely, as though the direction he occupied was simply not one she was required to orient herself by. He stood in the lane and watched her go. He watched the cottage door open and close behind her. He stood in the lane for a while longer, and then he walked to the cottage door and knocked. There was a pause, a longer pause than the distance from the door to anywhere in the cottage would require. Then the door opened. She was standing in the doorway and she looked at him and he looked at her, and the things he had been working out how to say for 4 months presented themselves to him and were immediately inadequate. she said, before he could. Whatever you are about to say, don't. And then she reached past him and picked up the cloth bag she had set beside the door, which he had been standing close enough to that he had simply not seen it, and she went back inside and left the door open, which was not an invitation, and was not a refusal. It was something more specific. It was, I am not giving you the dignity of a closed door, which means you may enter if you can manage to be worth the trouble. He stepped inside. The cottage was warm and smelled of herbs and old books and the particular lived-in quality of a place that was loved without being decorated. An old woman with extremely alert eyes was sitting at the far end of the room with her knitting and her cat, and she looked at Aldrich with the unhurried assessment of someone evaluating stock at a market, and then she looked at Sarah, who had set the bag on the table and begun removing vegetables from it with deliberate calm. The old woman said nothing. She went back to her knitting. Aldrich stood in the doorway of the small, warm cottage with the cold of outside still on his clothes, and he looked at Sarah, who was putting a turnip on the table, and he did not speak because she had asked him not to, and he had learned, in the past 4 months, that some instructions were worth following for reasons he was still working out. The cat jumped onto the table and was removed. The fire made its sound. Outside the window, Duskfen went about its afternoon without concern for anything happening inside the herbalist's cottage, which was ordinary and small and precisely the right size for the moment it was containing. Aldrich stayed in Duskfen, not with her and not because she offered. He took a room at the small tavern at the end of the main lane, which had 2 upstairs rooms, and a landlord named Bert who asked no questions because he had long since concluded that questions shortened his life expectancy. Cale and the other 5 riders distributed themselves with practiced discretion, occupying various positions in and around the village with the convincing appearance of men simply waiting for their employer's business to conclude. Duskfen watched them with the contained interest of a village that was accustomed to minding its business, which meant it noticed everything and said very little. The first morning, Aldrich came to the cottage at dawn. Edna answered the door. She looked at him for a considerable period. She is not awake, Edna said. I know, Aldrich said. Then what do you want? Edna said. He appeared, Edna would think later, like a man who had a great deal he wanted and had forgotten how to want things in a way that made any sense. I would like to speak with her when she is available, he said. She is available when she decides to be available, Edna said. Come back at the 9th hour. She closed the door. He came back at the 9th hour. Sarah was at the work table when Edna opened the door and stood aside without comment. Sarah did not look up immediately. She was writing in the record book, completing an entry, and she did so because the entry needed to be completed, and because she was going to finish what she was doing, before she turned to face whatever this was. She finished the entry. She put down the pen. She turned. He was standing in the center of the room with his coat still on, which made him look larger than the room knew what to do with, and he was looking at her in a way that she had never seen from him in 3 years of the palace, which was to say, directly, without the measured management she had always felt in his attention. He looked, to be honest, like a man who had been sleeping badly. She found this neither satisfying nor distressing. She noted it the way she noted useful information. Sit down, she said. You are making the room feel small. He sat. He sat at the small chair across from the work table, and he was clearly built for furniture that was larger than this chair, and the disproportion of it might have been funny in a different moment. She looked at him. Say what you came to say, she said. A pause. I heard what you heard, he said. She waited. In the corridor, he said. What I said to the council. I know what you heard, and I know why you left. Do you? She said. Yes. He stopped. He looked at his hands, then back at her. I need you to know that what I said was... He stopped again. She waited. It was not a patient waiting. It was a precise one. It was not the entirety of the truth, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Not the entirety, she said. No. So part of it was true, she said. He did not answer quickly. She noticed that. He was working, visibly, on something, the way a person works when they are not accustomed to the kind of honesty a specific moment is requiring of them. Part of it was what the council needed to hear, he said carefully. Part of it was what you needed to believe, she said. The room was very quiet. He looked at her with a directness that cost him something. She could see the cost of it in the way his jaw held, and he said, yes. She had not expected that. She had expected defense, or explanation, or the political framing that powerful men used when they needed to make wrong things sound like strategies. She had not expected the honest and uncomfortable yes. She looked at the fire. I left because I heard you describe me as a pawn, she said. Not in anger, not in a heated moment. In a measured conversation with people whose respect you wanted. You were calm. You were controlled. You said it the way you say true things. He said nothing. I was not even surprised, she said. That was the worst of it. I heard it and I thought, yes, that is what I am here for. I have known that, and now I know that you know it, and have always known it, and that the arrangement has worked exactly as arrangements work, which is to say it worked for everyone whose name was on the paper. Your name was not on the paper, he said. No, she said. My father's was, that is the point. The fire. Outside, someone was moving in the lane, feet on the frozen ground. You were going to tell me, he said, about the child. She looked back at him. I do not know, she said. I had not decided. You would have decided, he said. Probably, she said. Eventually, when I understood what I was deciding toward. She looked at him. That is not a conversation that can happen in a palace where the outcome is already arranged, where the child would be an heir before it was a person, where I would be the vessel rather than the mother. He was silent. She leaned forward slightly, not in anger, in the precision of someone making sure a thing is understood. I am the mother, she said. First. Whatever else this child is or becomes or is required to be by the world you come from, this child is mine first. That is not negotiable. He held her gaze. No, he said, it is not. She studied him. You say that as though you mean it, she said. I do mean it, he said. You have not, she said carefully, given me extensive evidence of the difference between what you mean and what you say, in contexts that are convenient for you. That landed. She watched it land. She had not said it to wound him. She had said it because it was true, and because true things needed to be said in daylight. He looked at the floor. He looked back at her. No, he said. I have not. Another silence. Then what do you want? She said. Practically, not the large version of it. The actual small practical answer to what you came here for. He thought about this for a moment, with the seriousness of someone who had learned, perhaps recently, that the large version of things was not always the one that mattered. I would like to talk to you, he said. Every morning, if you will allow it, not about the arrangement, not about the council or the territory, or what comes next politically. I would like to talk to you, the way two people talk to each other when they are trying to understand what is actually true between them. She looked at him. That is not a thing you are practiced in, she said. No, he said, it is not. You will be terrible at it, she said. Almost certainly, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in the room, faint and unmistakable. The 9th hour, she said. Come to the door. Edna will decide if you are allowed in, which means you are under the additional review of a woman who has my full confidence and no patience whatsoever for nonsense. Understood, he said. And you will sit in that chair, she said, which is clearly too small for you, and you will not make it the council room. And if you begin to speak in the voice you use when you are managing something, I will ask you to leave. Yes, he said. And you will tell me one true thing, she said, each morning, something that is not about strategy or arrangement, just true. He looked at her. One true thing, he said. To start, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the care of someone handling something they had not held before and did not want to drop, I have been looking for you since the morning after the festival. I have not slept well in 4 months, and when I saw you at the market stall I was not prepared for it, which has not happened to me in a very long time. She looked at him. That was 3 things, she said. Yes, he said. A silence. Tomorrow at the 9th hour, she said, and went back to her record book. He stood, and the chair made a small sound of relief, and he looked at her for a moment longer, and then he went to the door and out into the cold of the village lane, and the door closed behind him. Edna appeared from the back room. She said nothing. She went to the fire and added a log to it. Well, Edna said finally, with the compression of a woman who had been listening through a wall and had opinions, and had chosen to keep them entirely to herself for now. Well, Sarah agreed. She picked up her pen. She did not go back to the record book entry immediately. She sat for a moment with the pen in her hand and looked at the fire. He had said, I was not prepared for it. She had not been prepared for that. She made a note of it. Then she went back to work. The next morning he came at the 9th hour and Edna let him in after what she described as routine assessment, which Sarah understood to mean she had looked at him for a long time and decided something she kept to herself. They sat. He was in the small chair again. The one true thing that morning was that he had read every margin note she had ever written in the translation documents, all of them, over 3 years, without commenting on them or acknowledging that he had read them. She looked at the table. "Why?" she said. "Because they were more useful than the council reports," he said, "and because they were the most honest thing in the palace." She looked up. "And you said nothing," she said. "No," he said. "For 3 years," she said. "Yes," he said. She held that. "You are," she said finally, "spectacularly bad at being a person." "I know," he said. Outside the window, the river was beginning to soften in the late winter light, and somewhere in the village, a door opened and closed, and an ordinary day was proceeding. Sarah looked at the man in the too small chair in her herbalist's cottage in the village she had chosen, and thought about 3 years of margin notes that had been read and never answered. She thought about what she was building here. She thought about what he was, what she was, what the child between them was going to need. She thought about the word pawn and the word replace and the corridor and the cold stone. She thought about the word chosen. And she began, very carefully, to think about what came next. Not because she had forgiven anything yet, not because the thing between them was resolved or simple or safe, but because she was the woman who had walked through the forest. And she decided what she walked toward. That was hers. It had always been the only thing that was entirely hers. She picked up her pen and wrote the date at the top of a new page and said, "Tell me about the Eastern Border Agreement. The one from 2 years ago. There were 3 things wrong with the secondary clause that I noted in the margin and no one corrected." And he leaned forward in the too small chair, and he talked to her. And she listened, and corrected him twice, and the morning went on. The late winter days in Duskfen arrived quietly, one after another, each one carrying a little more light than the one before, the sky staying pale and wide and cold, but the afternoons beginning to hold some warmth in the hour before the sun went down. The river ice was thinning. The first birds that had been absent all season appeared in the mornings, small and purposeful. Sarah noticed these things the way she noticed everything, with the quiet attention she had always brought to the world around her, and the noticing was different now because the world she was noticing was one she had chosen to be in, which gave the small details a weight they had not carried before. Aldrich came to the cottage at the 9th hour every morning. Edna let him in every morning, after the pause that Edna maintained on principle, and he sat in the chair that was the wrong size for him, and they talked. Sarah had established the terms of it early, and held to them. It would not be the council room. It would not be strategy or arrangement. One true thing, to begin, and then conversation that was not managed. He was bad at this in the specific way she had predicted, which was to say that he was not dishonest in it. He simply kept reaching for the structures he knew, the political framing, the measured presentation, the voice that handled things from a slight remove. She noticed each time he did it, and she said so, plainly, without cruelty, and he would stop and think and try again. He was trying. She was watching him try. This was not the same as trusting him. She was clear-eyed about the difference. On the 5th morning, the one true thing was that he had stood outside the door of her room in the palace once, 3 months after she arrived, holding a letter he had intended to give her himself, rather than sending it through the household staff, and he had stood there for a considerable time, and then walked away, and sent it through the household staff. She looked at him. "What was in the letter?" she said. "It was an acknowledgement of the translation notes on the border agreement," he said. "The 3rd one. You had identified a significant error in the land division clause and you had written it in the margin, and no one in my council had noticed, and you had. You wrote me a letter about it," she said. "And then did not give it to you," he said. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know what it would open," he said. She looked at the fire. There it was, honest and uncomfortable and too late by 3 years, and also, undeniably, more real than anything he had said to her in the same span of time. "You knew," she said. "Not an accusation, a recognition." "Not clearly," he said. "Not the way I know things I have examined and decided. Something I had not yet examined." "And so you closed it," she said. "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly. "I had a habit too," she said, "of watching branches outside my window when I needed to feel still. There was one outside the East Wing library. I watched it for months. A long branch that moved in the wind and came back to the same position every time." She looked at him. "I think we were both very good at not examining things." He held that. "Yes," he said. "I think so." The fire made its sound. Outside the window, the morning light moved across the river. "I am not telling you this to make things easier," she said. I am telling you because we are trying to be honest, and that is what honesty looks like. It is inconvenient, and partial, and frequently late. Yes, he said. You were not only the villain of the corridor, she said. That sentence was what it was, and I am not revising it. But I also was not without my own closures. I was the one with the authority, he said. That makes the failures not equivalent. She looked at him. He looked back. That is true, she said. I know it is, he said. That is why I am here in a village in the south with a chair that is too small for me and an old woman who assesses me like livestock every morning. She looked at her hands. And then, very briefly and very precisely, she almost smiled. She did not quite, but almost. He saw it. She knew he saw it. She let him see it, which was its own small decision, made consciously, in the particular way she made all decisions now. The late February afternoon, 2 days before the baby came, was clear and cold, and the river was fully audible from the cottage, which it was not always, only when the wind came from a particular direction and the ice was thin enough to not muffle it. Edna had gone to the Miller's family for a house visit, and Sarah was alone in the cottage, sitting at the work table with a cup of tea she was not drinking, not because she was ill, but because she was thinking about a very large number of things at once, and the tea was simply there, warm under her hands. She was thinking about what came next, not in the anxious way she had thought about what came next in the palace, in the deliberate way she thought about things now, the way she thought about herb preparations and patient care, and the specific steps required to move from a problem to a solution. The situation had components. Aldrich was here. He was trying to be a different version of himself in ways that were halting and partial and genuine. The council was not here, which was a temporary condition. The child was arriving imminently, which was not temporary at all. There were things that needed to be negotiated and things that needed to be settled and things that she would not move on. She knew the things she would not move on. The child was hers first. That had not changed and would not change. She would not go back to the palace as an arrangement. If she went back to anything, it would be as herself, the person she had become in Duskfen and in the Ashenwood and in the East Wing Library with her margin notes, and that person had terms. She was drafting those terms in her head with the methodical attention she brought to documents when the door opened and Aldrich came in. She looked at him. He looked at her, and then at the cold tea, and he picked up the teapot from the hearth and refilled the cup without asking, which was an extraordinarily ordinary thing for him to do, and which she noticed. He put the pot back and sat in the chair. "Tell me something," she said. "Which kind?" he said. "Any kind," she said. "Something true. Not the important truths. A small one." He looked at the window for a moment. "I used to read the trading manifests," he said. "The ones from the port cities, not because they were politically significant, but because I found them interesting. The lists of goods, what was being moved, where it came from." A pause. "I stopped when the council started attending those review sessions. It seemed an odd thing to be interested in." She looked at him. "Why did you stop?" she said. "Because the council attended, or because you did not want them to see it?" A beat. "The second one," he said. She nodded. "I like the trading manifests too," she said. "The ones from the Northern Territories list every type of timber separately. I found that satisfying." He looked at her. Something happened in the room that was not dramatic and was not small. It was the specific quality of two people who have been performing careful versions of themselves at a distance, discovering, in the most ordinary possible exchange, that there are adjacent rooms in them that have not been compared. "I know," he said quietly. "You wrote about it, the timber categories, the Third Northern Territory Agreement. Your note in the margin said, the taxonomic specificity of the lumber listings suggests a forest culture that categorizes its resources at a level of refinement that the trade language fails to capture." She stared at him. "You have memorized my margin notes," she said. "Not intentionally," he said. She looked at the cup of tea he had refilled for her. She looked at him. "Aldrich," she said. He looked at her. "I am going to give you a list of things that are required," she said. "Not negotiable things. Required ones. If you agree to them, we can discuss what comes next. If you do not, then I will remain in Duskfen and we will negotiate a different arrangement entirely. One that does not require agreement because it will be a legal one, clear and documented, with Edna and the village council as witnesses." "All right," he said. "Do not say all right before you hear them," she said. "Then say them," he said. She set down her cup. Yet she looked at him with the clarity she had been building since October. Since the corridor. Since the Ashenwood. since the first morning in this cottage, and the first night she had slept without dreaming about stone walls. "The child is mine," she said. "This is first and always, not an heir before they are a person. Mine, with a name I choose and a childhood that is not arranged around political use. The child meets the council when I decide it is appropriate and not before." "Yes," he said. "My position," she said, "if I return to any palace of yours, is not ward, not arrangement, not instrument. It is my own. I will have my own work, my own standing, my own voice in discussions that affect me directly. This includes but is not limited to any future negotiation involving my family, my territories, or my child." "Yes," he said. "If you say something to a council again," she said, "that is not what you mean. I expect to know about it. Not the public face of things, the actual position behind it. If you are performing for the council and the performance contradicts what is true, I hear the contradiction." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a harder thing," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I am naming it." He held her eyes. "Yes," he said. "And Edna comes," she said. He looked at her. "The palace needs a head healer," she said. "The current one is adequate and unimaginative. Edna is 70-something years old and has more knowledge in her left hand than the entire palace physician's hall. She will require a good room, a proper budget, and the authority to reorganize the medical practice as she sees fit." A pause. "Does Edna know you are negotiating this on her behalf?" he said. "No," Sarah said. "But she will agree. She is running out of room for her jars here." He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do in 3 years in the palace. He laughed. Not a polished laugh, not a managed one, a real one, brief and surprised, as though it had come out before he could decide whether to allow it. It changed his face entirely. She looked at him. She thought, oh. She thought, that is what was behind the wall. She put that away to think about later, carefully, in the precise way she saved things that were important. "The terms," he said, when the moment had settled. "All of them. I agree to them." "You will sign them," she said, "in writing, with Edna as witness." "Yes," he said. "And if you break them," she said. "Then you will be entirely right to leave again," he said, "and I will have no standing to look for you." She looked at him for a long time. "You understand," she said, "that I am not the same person who stood in that corridor." "I know," he said. "I am not going to become her again," she said. "I know," he said. "She would not have made this list." She looked at him. "No," she said. "She would not have." The fire burned. The river ran outside. The tea was warm. 2 days later, in the first hours of a late February morning when the frost was still hard on the ground, and the sky above Duskfen was very clear, and very dark before the dawn came, the baby arrived. The baby came in the early dark, before the first light appeared in the east, in the precise and serious hours when the world is most itself, stripped of the ordinary daylight business and reduced to its essential facts. Edna was there. 3 of the village women were there, including the miller's wife who had brought the blanket in December and who turned out to be extraordinarily calm in the specific moments when calm is most needed. Aldrich was outside. Sarah had not asked him to be outside. She had not told him to come. He had appeared in the lane before midnight, when the first signs were obvious, and had stood at the cottage door and had not knocked, had simply been there in the cold dark, and Edna had glanced out the window and said nothing, and Sarah had said nothing, and he had stayed in the lane. He was there for 6 hours. She did not think about him during those hours. She was occupied with things that required her full attention, and she gave it, and Edna and the miller's wife were exactly what was needed, and the fire was high and the room was warm, and at the 6th hour of the dark morning the baby arrived in the world with the emphatic opinion of someone who had been building toward this moment, and found it entirely satisfactory. He was a boy. She heard this before she saw it, Edna's flat commentary. A boy, good lungs, and then they placed him in her arms and she looked at him, and all of the large things she had been carrying since October became very small, very fast, in the specific way that happens when something more important than any of them has just become real. He had dark eyes that could not yet see anything clearly but were open and looking, and he had a jaw that she recognized, and a small determined set to his face that she also recognized, but from the inside rather than the outside, and he was, completely and beyond any argument, the most important thing she had ever held. She said, to him quietly and to herself and to no one else in the room, "Hello, I have been waiting for you." He moved his mouth. She laughed, surprised, and the sound of it filled the warm room. Edna asked, after the necessary time had passed and things were settled and the morning light was beginning at the window, whether Aldrich should be told. Sarah thought about this for a moment. "Send him in," she said. He came through the door the way he moved when he was being careful about something, which she had learned was different from the way he moved when he was merely controlled. He crossed the room to where she was sitting with the child in her arms, and he stood and looked. She watched him look. He looked at the child with the expression of a man who had thought himself prepared for this, and had discovered, at the last moment, that no preparation was possible. Something happened in his face that was not any of the things she had ever seen in it during 3 years in the palace, or the weeks in Duskfen. It was unguarded in the way a face is unguarded when the thing it encounters is too immediate to manage. He reached out one hand, slowly, and she allowed it, and his very large hand came down gently over the baby's head, which the baby disregarded entirely, being occupied with more pressing matters. Aldrich said nothing. She watched his face. Then she said, quietly, "He is not leverage. He is not a treaty. He is mine first." Aldrich looked at her. "Yes," he said, "he is." The morning came in at the window in the particular way of the first morning of March, pale and certain, and the river was running freely outside now, no ice left, and somewhere in the village Duskfen was beginning its day, the baker opening and the mill starting and the ordinary machinery of ordinary life proceeding with cheerful indifference to anything special. The baby slept. Sarah rested. Edna sat in her chair with the cat and her knitting and said nothing, which was the highest form of approval she expressed. Aldrich sat on a chair near the fire, not the small chair, a different chair, one that was almost the right size. He sat and looked at the fire, and she looked at him between sleeping, and neither of them spoke, and the room was full of the particular quiet of something that was just beginning. Later, when the baby was being passed between the village women with the reverent enthusiasm that Duskfen brought to new arrivals, and Edna had gone to prepare something for Sarah to eat, Aldrich came to sit near her. She was sitting up against the pillow, exhausted in the rebuilt way, the way that feels like having been completely taken apart and reassembled into something that is essentially the same but knows itself better. "What will you name him?" Aldrich said. She had thought about this for months. "Owen," she said. "My brother's name." She watched him. He said, "Owen." "Yes," she said. He was quiet. "It is a good name," he said. She looked at him. She thought about what he was. She thought about what she was. She thought about Owen sleeping in the miller's wife's arms across the room, entirely unaware of the large and complicated world he had arrived in, interested only in the immediate specific fact of being alive and warm and held. She thought about the terms, written out that evening in Edna's clear handwriting, and signed by both of them, and witnessed by Edna with the expression of someone filing a document they fully intend to enforce. She thought about the one true thing, every morning. She thought about a branch outside a palace window, moving and returning. She thought about a man standing in a cold lane for 6 hours in the dark. She was not done being angry. She was honest enough with herself to know that. The anger was not finished yet, and might not be for a long time, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she was, in the specific and irrevocable way of someone who has walked through a forest, and come out the other side, no longer afraid. And she had terms. And she had made a list. And the list had been signed. She thought that was enough for now. She thought, one morning at a time. She looked at Aldrich sitting near the fire with his face turned toward the sleeping child. She said, "Tell me one true thing." He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been a better version of myself," he said, "in this village with this chair that is too small, than I have been in my own palace for the last 11 years. She held that. "That," she said quietly, "is either the most important thing you have said, or a very good sentence." "Both," he said. She looked at the fire. "Yes," she said. "Both." Outside, March was arriving in the south, slow and certain, and Duskfen was going about its morning, and the world was doing what it always does, which is continue, with or without the permission of any of the people living inside it. Owen slept. The fire burned. And in the warm cottage at the end of the village lane, the day went on. 2 men from the High Council arrived in Duskfen on a Wednesday. They did not announce themselves, they did not carry documents or wear court colors. They were dressed as merchants, traveling light, with the professional casualness of people who traveled in disguise frequently enough to be comfortable in it. They arrived at the tavern, took a meal, and asked the landlord, with practiced ease, whether the king was in residence. The landlord told them the inn was at capacity and suggested they try the settlement town 2 hours south. They tried the market instead. By that evening, Aldrich knew they were there. Cale, who had been quietly and continuously useful in Duskfen in ways that the village had decided to find normal, had seen them arrive and had recognized them both. He delivered this information to Aldrich in the tavern, with the flatness of someone handing over a report they found unsurprising. Aldrich sat with the information for a moment. Then he went to the cottage. He found Sarah at the work table, one hand holding a document she was reviewing, and the other resting near Owen, who was asleep in the basket that the miller's wife had brought and that was temporarily residing on the work table, because it was the warmest place in the cottage, and Owen had opinions about warmth already. She looked up when he entered. He sat. He told her. She looked at him while he talked. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she looked at Owen in his basket, and then back at Aldrich. "Lord Carver," she said. "Yes," he said. "He was the one in the corridor," she said. "His was the voice I recognized." "Yes," Aldrich said. "And you will meet with them," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "at the tavern. They will not come here." "No," she said. "They will not." She looked at the document in her hand. She set it down. "They want you to bring us back." "They want me to return," he said, "and to bring the heir." She looked at him. "Owen," she said. "Owen," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "And me," she said. "In the form they had before," he said, with a flatness that was not indifference but something harder, something deliberate, "the ward, the instrument of the arrangement. Which I have a document that says is no longer the form," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood up. She crossed to the window and looked out at the lane, at the evening light on the stone buildings, at the tavern at the far end where two men in merchant clothing were eating a meal they had not paid for with the money they were pretending to trade with. "What are you going to tell them?" she said. "That is in part what I came to discuss with you," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "In part," she said. "The other part is already decided," he said. She turned. "Tell me the decided part," she said. He stood up from the chair. He was not performing anything. She had learned to read him in the past weeks with the precision that came from paying close attention for a long time, and what she read was a man who had arrived at something through the specific uncomfortable path of thinking about it honestly instead of managing it. "The arrangement," he said, "as the council understood it, is dissolved. I am dissolving it. Not because it is politically inconvenient, because it was wrong, and because I had the authority to make a different choice 3 years ago, and I did not make it. And the document you and I signed is the correct version of things, and the council will be told so." She looked at him. "They will not accept it easily," she said. "No," he said. "They will push," she said. "Yes," he said. "And when they push," she said. "I will not move," he said. She held his eyes. She had not decided yet whether to believe this, in the specific sense of believing that it would hold when the pressure was real. She was honest about that. She believed that he meant it now, tonight, in this cottage with the fire and the sleeping baby. She was reserving her final judgment for the moment when it was tested. She was practical that way. "All right," she said. "Then here is what I want you to add." He looked at her. She crossed back to the work table. She took a new sheet of paper and sat down, and she wrote quickly and cleanly, the way she wrote when she knew exactly what she wanted to say, which was how she had always written the things that mattered most. She wrote for several minutes. Then she turned the paper and pushed it toward him. He read it. He read it twice. "You want to attend," he said. "I want to attend," she said. "Tomorrow, at the tavern. Not as the ward, as myself, with the document we signed, and I want to be present when you tell them." He looked at her. "That is not how these meetings are usually conducted," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. "All right," he said. "You did not hesitate that time," she said. "No," he said. She looked at the paper. She looked at him. "Good," she said. The next morning, the two councilmen sat in the tavern's front room with cups of something warm and the expectant posture of men who were accustomed to outcomes going the way they had arranged them. Aldrich came in first. They stood. They performed the appropriate greetings. They sat back down. Lord Carver, the heavier of the two, opened his mouth to begin what was clearly a prepared opening. Then the door opened again. Sarah walked in. She was wearing her own clothes, the ones she had bought in Duskfen, plain and practical, and nothing the palace would have put her in. She had Owen against her in the carrying wrap the miller's wife had shown her to use. She sat down at the table beside Aldrich and she looked at both men with the direct and undecorated attention of someone who was exactly where she meant to be. The council men looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at them. He placed the document on the table. "I will explain the new terms," he said. Lord Carver looked at the document. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the baby. He looked back at Aldrich with an expression that contained a great deal that he was choosing not to say. "My lord," he said, "the council's position on the arrangement." "The arrangement," Aldrich said, "is changed. This document details the change. You will take a copy back to the council and they will be informed that this is not a negotiation." A silence. "The girl," Carver began. "Her name," Aldrich said, "is Sarah." Carver stopped. Sarah looked at him. She looked at him with the full and exact attention of a woman who had stood in a corridor and heard what she was called, and had walked through a forest and built a different life, and sat across from him now with a document in hand and a baby in arms, and was not 1 inch of anything that could be described as a well-kept pawn. Lord Carver looked at his cup. "The council will want to review the terms," he said, in a different tone. "They may review them," Aldrich said. "They will not alter them." The other councilman, who had said nothing, said carefully, "The treaty's continuance will be managed," Aldrich said, "as it always has been, by the actual terms of the trade agreements and the border accords, not by the social position of a woman in my household." Silence. Sarah said, for the first time since she had sat down, "The lumber clause in the second Northern Border Agreement has a secondary provision that has not been exercised. If you want to discuss treaty continuance, I suggest we start there. I have notes." Both men looked at her. Aldrich looked at her. He said nothing, but something moved through his expression, very briefly, that she had seen once before, in the cottage, when he had laughed without deciding to. She went back to the table and said, "Shall I continue, or do you need a moment?" Lord Carver took a moment. When they left 2 hours later, they had the document and a copy of her notes on the lumber clause, and the very slightly dazed quality of men who had arrived, expecting to manage a situation, and had found that the situation had already managed itself into a shape they had not anticipated. She watched them go from the tavern doorway. Owen had slept through the entire meeting. Cale appeared beside her. "That was," he said, and then did not finish the sentence, which from Cale was the equivalent of a long speech. "Yes," she said. Aldrich stood beside her and they both watched the council men mount their horses and ride south, and the village lane was ordinary around them, and the March morning was cold and clear. "They will bring it to the full council," he said. "Yes," she said. "The council will debate it." "Yes," she said. "And then they will accept it," he said, "because the alternative is a public dissolution of the arrangement, and everything that was built around it, and neither the treaty nor their reputations survive that." "I know," she said. "You had already calculated that," he said. She looked at him. "I calculated it in October," she said. "In the corridor, before I left." He was quiet for a moment. "You were already thinking about the terms," he said. "I was thinking about the terms when I was packing," she said. "I did not know if I would ever need to use them, but I thought about them." He looked at her. "Who were you in that palace?" he said, not an accusation, something more like, "How did I not see this?" "I was exactly who I am now," she said. "You were not looking." He held that. "No," he said, "I was not." They stood in the doorway of the tavern in the March morning with the village going about its life around them, and Owen made a small sound against her chest, the sound of someone waking up and immediately forming opinions, and she shifted him slightly and he settled. "We will need to go back," she said. It was not a question. "Eventually," he said. "When you are ready, on your terms." "On our terms," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the lane, at the herbalist's cottage with the herb bundles at the door, at the river visible between the buildings, at the village that had held her through a winter and a birth and the particular courage of starting over. "Not yet," she said. "No," he said, "not yet." "But I will need to write several documents first," she said. "I expect so," he said. "The council is going to find," she said, "that the terms are more extensive than what was in that first letter." "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. "One true thing," she said. He did not hesitate. "I am not afraid of your terms," he said. "I am afraid of a world where you do not set them." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went inside to get her paper and her pen. She had work to do. The spring came to Duskfen in the particular way it comes to places that have endured a serious winter, with an almost excessive abundance of light and color after the months of pale and cold. The river ran high and fast with meltwater. The fields on the eastern side of the village turned green in a matter of days. Children appeared outdoors in numbers that suggested they had been kept inside for too long, and were now making up for it with great energy. Owen was 6 weeks old and had already developed, under the close observation of the village, a complete personality. He was interested in light and movement and the sound of the river and Edna's cat, which he tracked with an expression of pure determination that suggested he intended to interact with it the moment his motor skills allowed. He ate with seriousness and slept with commitment and was, in the opinion of everyone in Duskfen, perfect in every particular. The village had taken to Aldrich in the same way it had taken to Sarah, which was to say with the practical interest of people who evaluated newcomers by what they contributed, rather than by where they came from. He had fixed a fence for the elderly man at the end of the east lane, unprompted, on a morning when he arrived for the 9th hour, and Edna's door was temporarily closed because she was with a patient, and he was left in the lane with nothing specific to do. The fence had been visibly broken for months. The elderly man had attempted to thank him and been waved off. The village had noted this with approval. He had also, quietly, arranged for a supply of specific medicinal materials that Edna had been unable to source locally, to be brought from the Northern Territories, which she discovered one morning when they arrived at the cottage door, and which she received with a silence that was, for Edna, the highest expression of gratitude. He was learning, Sarah thought, slowly and partially and sometimes badly, which was how she had said he would learn, and which she found more believable than any other rate of progress would have been. The council's response to the document arrived in the 2nd week of March, delivered by a formal messenger who handed the letter to Aldrich and stood at a respectful distance while it was read. Aldrich brought it to Sarah. She read it. Then she read it again. "They are proposing modifications," she said. "Yes," he said. "To 3 of the 12 terms," she said. "Yes," he said. "These modifications," she said, pointing, "are all to terms that directly affect my standing in council discussions." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "They are afraid of me," she said. There was no satisfaction in it, just recognition. "I think," Aldrich said carefully, "that they are afraid of what you represent, a position in their structure that they did not anticipate and cannot easily categorize." "Uncategorizable is useful," she said. "I thought you might think so," he said. She looked at the letter. She put it on the table. She thought about the terms. She thought about what was worth holding, and what was worth negotiating, and what was simply not going to move. "Tell them no," she said, "on all 3. And tell them that if they send another modification letter, I will be drafting the response myself, and it will include a full analysis of the secondary lumber clause that will require them to admit in writing that the current arrangement costs the Northern Territories approximately 800 units of trade value per cycle, that has been incorrectly credited to the council's account, rather than the territories." Aldrich looked at her. "Do you have that analysis?" he said. "I have been writing it for 2 weeks," she said. A silence. "Were you going to tell me about it?" he said. "When it was finished," she said. "Would you like to read the draft?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I would." She got up and found it in the stack of documents on the side table and brought it to him and watched him read it. He read it carefully and with complete attention, the way she had seen him read documents in the East Wing library once, through the open door, before she had moved on. When he finished, he looked up. "This is better than anything the council has produced on the Northern Agreement in 8 years, he said. "I know," she said. "I have read 8 years of what they produced." He set the document down. "I should have listened to you in the palace," he said. "Earlier, actively." "Yes," she said, "but you did not, and here we are, and the document exists now instead of then, and now is what we have." He held that. "You are not a forgiving person," he said. "I am an honest one," she said. "Those are different things." "And you have not forgiven me," he said. She looked at him. "I am in the process of deciding," she said. "It is not a quick process. You are not owed a quick process." "No," he said. "But I am here," she said. "And I am writing documents that use we and ours instead of you and yours. And that is something." He looked at the document. "It is a great deal," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She took the document back. She sat down at the table. "The response to the council goes tomorrow," she said. "I will have Cale draft it," he said. "I will draft it," she said, not looking up. Cale can review it for the formal language. I want Lord Carver to read something that comes from me and knows that it comes from me. He will know, Aldrich said. Good, she said. She picked up her pen. Owen, in his basket nearby, made a small sound of deep satisfaction in his sleep, the sound of someone having an excellent dream, and neither of them looked at him but both of them noticed, in the way that parents notice things without needing to perform the noticing. The council's final response arrived in late March. They accepted all 12 terms. Sarah read the acceptance letter at the work table on a Tuesday morning in the first real warmth of spring, with the window open and the river sound coming through it, and she read it twice and then she set it down. Edna was across the room sorting herbs. She glanced over. Well, Edna said. Well, Sarah said. You are going back, Edna said. It was not a question. We are going back, Sarah said. All of us, eventually. Edna looked at her with the eyes that missed nothing. I am not going to a palace, Edna said. You are going to a palace that currently has no proper head healer, Sarah said, and a medical hall that has been run on inadequate principles for at least a decade, and more patients than its current staff can properly treat, and a budget that I have negotiated upward significantly, and a room that is larger than this cottage. Edna was quiet for a moment. What are the windows like? She said. I specified south-facing, Sarah said. In writing. It is in the document. Edna picked up the herb bundle she had been sorting. She turned it over in her hands. She said nothing for a moment. The cat comes, she said. The cat comes, Sarah said. My equipment comes exactly as it is, Edna said. No one reorganizes my supply system. No one touches your supply system, Sarah said. And I report to you, Edna said, not to the palace physician. You report to yourself, Sarah said, and occasionally to me. That is in the document also. Edna set down the herb bundle. She looked at the room. She looked at the window with the river outside. She looked at the cat, which was on the supply shelf again, and would need to be removed. When? She said. Late April, Sarah said, when Owen is old enough for travel and the roads are fully clear. Edna nodded. Once, definitively. Then I had better start packing the jars, she said. She began packing the jars. The last weeks in Duskfen had a quality that was not grief and was not quite nostalgia. It was something in between, the feeling of a place you have chosen becoming a place you are choosing to leave, which is entirely different from being sent away from somewhere, which is the only other departure Sarah had experience with. The village had a gathering for her on the last Friday, not a formal thing, just people appearing at the herbalist's cottage and the lane outside it with food and small gifts for Owen, and the entirely characteristic Duskfen combination of warmth and complete avoidance of sentiment. The miller's wife, who had brought the blanket in December, held Owen for a long time, and said nothing, except that he was very good, which was the highest compliment available in her vocabulary. The ancient man from the East Lane came and told Aldrich, with complete seriousness, that the fence repair had been done wrong, and that Aldrich should not repair fences in future, and Aldrich accepted this with the gravity it deserved. The baker pressed 4 extra loaves on Sarah, and would not be talked out of it. And in the evening, when the gathering had thinned and the lane was quiet, Sarah stood outside the cottage door in the spring dark and looked at the river, which was still running fast with the last of the meltwater, bright in the moonlight, purposeful and unconcerned. She thought about October. She thought about a larder door and a cold night and the ashen wood ahead of her, enormous in the dark. She thought about what it had felt like to step out of that door, the terrifying clean fact of it, the weight of what she was carrying and the weight of what she was leaving, and the specific cold of the October air against her face when there were no more walls around her. She had not known then what she was walking toward. She had known what she was walking away from. That had been enough. Aldrich appeared beside her. He was quiet in the way he was learning to be quiet, not the controlled silence of a man managing something, but the simple silence of someone who understood that some moments did not require filling. They stood and looked at the river. One true thing, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the version of myself that I found in this village, he said. I know that sounds like a large statement. I do not make it lightly. She looked at the river. It is a large statement, she said. Yes, he said. I will hold you to it, she said. I know you will, he said. She looked at him. Something had been shifting over the weeks, in the specific careful way that things shift when they are real rather than decided. She was not at the end of it. She was somewhere in the middle of it, which was where honest things lived. In the middle, before they had resolved themselves into whatever they were going to become. She was in the middle. She was all right with the middle. Good, she said. She went back inside. The fire was low, and Edna had gone to bed, and Owen was sleeping in his basket with the cat beside him, because the cat had decided over the past weeks that Owen was either a sibling or a very small piece of territory, and either way was not to be left unguarded. She picked up her pen. She wrote a letter to her brother Owen, the first letter she had sent since October, telling him that his namesake had his ears and someone else's jaw, and was, in her considered and partial opinion, the most interesting person she had ever met. She sealed it. She put it with the morning's post. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. In the morning they would begin packing. In April they would go back. Not to the palace as it had been, not to the arrangement as it had been, to something that did not have a name yet because it had not finished becoming itself. She was all right with that too. She was, in fact, more than all right. She was the woman who had written the terms. She was the woman who had walked through the forest. She was the woman who had sat across a table from Lord Carver with a baby on her chest and her notes in her hand and had said, "Shall I continue?" She was the woman who had chosen Duskfen and who was now choosing what came next. And the choosing was the thing, the irreducible fact of it, the thing that could not be arranged or placed or maintained, the thing that was entirely and permanently hers. She slept. Outside, the river ran. The cat kept watch. And the night moved toward morning in the patient way of all nights everywhere, without hurrying, without waiting, simply continuing, the way everything does when it has somewhere to be and knows the way. The palace was exactly as she had left it, and also entirely different, which was a thing she had expected but which still arrived as its own distinct experience. They came in the late afternoon of a day in the last week of April, when the light was that specific warm gold of the earliest spring evenings, falling across the dark stone and making it look, briefly, less austere than it was. The ashenwood was fully green at this distance, the trees that had been bare and waiting all winter now completely clothed, and the road from the south came up through the open land with the palace growing at the end of it in the way it always had, large and old and certain of itself. Sarah sat on horseback and looked at it. Owen was in the carrying wrap. He looked at the palace with the interested calm of someone who had not been anywhere before, and found all locations equally worth investigating. She had chosen to arrive on horseback rather than in the carriage Aldrich had offered. She wanted to arrive under her own movement, which was not a symbolic thing, it was a practical one. She wanted the feeling of having come here rather than been delivered. Cale rode beside her and said nothing, which she had come to understand as Cale's version of support. Edna was in the carriage with the cat and 17 boxes of medicinal supplies that the carriage driver had learned, over the course of 3 days of travel, not to comment on. They passed through the palace gates. The household staff were assembled in the courtyard in the way that households assembled when their king returned, organized and attentive and performing the correct expressions with the practiced ease of people who had been doing this for years. They looked at Sarah. She had expected this, and she held their attention without difficulty, meeting each face she recognized with a directness that was neither cold nor warm but simply present. She had dressed carefully, not in the palace style, in her own clothes, good ones, well-made, chosen in Duskfen by herself, dark blue and plain and completely hers. Owen was visible in the wrap at her chest. She had not covered him or adjusted the wrap to make him less obvious. He was there. He was Owen. That was the fact of it. A woman in the second row, one of the senior household managers, caught her eye and gave her a look that was not defiance, and was not welcome, and was not either of the things she had expected. It was something more careful than that, a reassessment. She had known this woman for 3 years, and the woman was looking at her as though seeing something for the first time. Sarah looked back. Then she looked ahead. They dismounted. The household manager stepped forward to escort her, as was the custom, and Sarah let it happen, moving through the familiar corridors of the palace with the accumulated strangeness of someone returning to a place that was the same shape as memory but was not memory. She had specified, in the documents, that her rooms would be changed. Not the East Wing room, different rooms. In the West Corridor, with south-facing windows and enough space for a working desk and Owen's things and Edna's visits, which she intended to be frequent. The West Wing rooms were prepared. She stood in the doorway of the main room and looked in. South-facing windows, the ashenwood visible in the distance, green and impenetrable. A desk that was not the palace's standard desk but a larger one, a working one, with the kind of surface that was wide enough to spread documents across without them threatening to fall. On the desk, in the center, was a jar. Just a jar. Clear glass, sealed. Inside it were dried herbs, the same mixture Edna used for the respiratory preparation she gave the village children in winter. Specific and unmistakable, and not decorative. She looked at it. She looked at Aldrich, who was in the doorway behind her. He said nothing. She looked at the jar. She thought about the east wing room with the dried lavender and the old ink. She thought about a piece of knowledge pressed flat inside her chest like a flower between pages. She thought about the branch outside the window. She picked up the jar and looked at it, and then she set it carefully in the corner of the desk, where it would be useful, and she turned around. "Thank you," she said. He said nothing. He was holding Owen, who had been transferred during the dismounting, and Owen was looking at the ceiling of the west wing corridor with the focused attention of someone making architectural assessments. "I have the first council meeting arranged for Thursday," Aldrich said. "The full council. They have been informed you will attend." "And of my standing at the meeting," she said. "Yes," he said, clearly and in writing, sent 10 days ago. "What was Lord Carver's response?" she said. "He had several responses," Aldrich said, over the course of several letters. The final one was an acknowledgement of the terms. "I would like to read the intermediate letters," she said. "I thought you might," he said. "They are on your desk." She looked at the desk. She looked at him. "You had them moved to my desk," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "One true thing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I told the household this morning," he said, "before we arrived, that the standard of address for you in this palace is no longer Ward. I told them the correct address is my lady, which is technically insufficient, but is the closest the protocol allows until the formal paperwork is complete, which will take another week." "What formal paperwork?" she said. "The paperwork that changes your status from Ward to something the council's legal structure can accommodate," he said, which took some creative argument on Cale's part, but which is, as of yesterday afternoon, legally permissible. She looked at him. He held Owen, who was now pulling at a button on Aldrich's coat with the absolute seriousness of someone who had found something worth investigating. "What is the status?" she said. "It does not have a precise historical precedent," he said. The council's archivist was very unhappy about this. He eventually accepted the term co-sovereign consort, which is a phrase that does not exist in any prior document and which means, in practical terms, that you have standing in this palace that is not derived from me and is not conditional on our personal arrangement and cannot be revoked by council vote. She stared at him. "That is not in any document we signed," she said. "No," he said. "It is something I decided after we signed the documents." "Without consulting me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I consulted Cale and Edna." "You consulted Edna," she said. She said, and I am quoting her precisely, that I was about 4 months late with the idea, but that she supposed it was better late than continuing to be wrong. Sarah looked at the window. She looked at Owen, who had gotten the button free and was examining it with triumph. She looked at Aldrich. She thought about the corridor, the cold stone, the word pawn. She thought about the forest, the October dark, the weight of what she had been carrying and the weight of what she was leaving. She thought about Duskfen and the river and the morning she had stood at the door in the snow and felt the specific feeling of being somewhere she had chosen. She thought about the jar of herbs on the desk. She thought about the fact that the letters were on her desk, which meant they had expected her to want them, which meant someone had thought about what she would want and had done the thing before she asked. She thought about a man standing in a cold lane for 6 hours in the dark. She was still in the middle of the thing. She was honest about that. She had not arrived anywhere final yet, and neither had he. And they were both, in their different ways, still becoming the people this required them to be. But the middle was not nothing. The middle was, in fact, where all the real work happened. "Come in," she said. She walked into the West Wing room. She went to the desk. She picked up the first of Lord Carver's intermediate letters and began to read. Behind her, Aldrich carried Owen into the room, and Owen looked at the ceiling and then at the window and then at the jar of herbs in the corner of the desk with the focused interest that he brought to all things, which was considerable and already entirely his own. The afternoon light came through the south-facing windows. The ashen wood was green in the distance. She read. The first council meeting was on Thursday. She arrived early. She sat at the table on the left side, which was not where the ward had ever sat, because the ward had not sat at this table. She placed her documents in front of her. She placed her pen beside them. She placed her hands on the table and looked at the room. The council members arrived in ones and twos. Several of them looked at her with the careful measurement of people recalibrating in real time. Several did not look at her, which was a different kind of measurement. Lord Carver arrived last and took the seat across from her, and looked at the documents in front of her, and then at her, and then he looked at his own papers and arranged them with great attention. Aldrich came in. He sat at the head of the table. He looked at the room. He looked at her. He gave her nothing in particular, no special signal or acknowledgement. He simply looked at her, as one person looks at another who is exactly where they are supposed to be. She looked back. The meeting began. She waited through the first 20 minutes of routine business with the patience of someone who knew how to wait. And then the lumber clause came up, as she had known it would, in the secondary discussion of the Northern Territory agreements. And she opened her document to the correct page and she said, with the clear and direct voice of someone who had spent 3 years watching from the edges, and was no longer at the edges. Before we proceed, there is an analysis of the secondary provision in Clause 12 that affects the trade credit allocation. I have reviewed the past 8 cycles. The current accounting is incorrect and it favors the Council's budget at the expense of the Northern Territories by a significant margin. I have the figures. The room was quiet. Lord Carver looked at his papers. My lady, he said carefully, testing the address, finding it sat in his mouth with more discomfort than he had expected. Yes, she said, looking at him directly. He looked at her. She looked back. He looked away first. She turned to the next page. The meeting continued. It was not the last difficult meeting. It was the first necessary one, and she knew the difference, and she walked through it the way she had walked through the forest, one step at a time, with the specific and undecorated courage of someone who was simply going where they had decided to go. When it ended and the council members filed out, Aldrich remained at the table. She gathered her documents. She stood. He was still seated, and he was looking at her, in the way she had come to recognize as the way he looked at things he was trying to understand rather than manage. Lord Carver, she said, is going to be a persistent difficulty. Yes, Aldrich said. I have a plan for Lord Carver, she said. I thought you might, he said. It involves the lumber figures, she said, and the secondary provision, and a formal review that will be very uncomfortable for him and very useful for the Northern Territories. When, he said. Next session, she said. I want to give him 1 week to prepare his arguments so they can be properly addressed rather than dismissed. He looked at her. You are giving him a week so that when you dismantle his position he has no remaining recourse, he said. Yes, she said. That is quite precise, he said. I learned from very good documents, she said. He almost smiled. She picked up her papers. I will be in my rooms until evening, she said. I want to draft the review document while the meeting is still clear in my mind. Edna asked if you would come to the new medical hall before dinner, he said. She is reorganizing the supply cabinets and has opinions about the current arrangement that require a witness. Tell her I will be there at the 6th hour, she said. I will tell her, he said. She walked to the door. At the door she stopped. One true thing, she said, without turning. He was quiet for a moment. I have not felt like myself, he said, in a very long time, until the past few months. I do not know yet if you are the reason for that, or if you simply happened to be present while I was becoming something I should have been years ago. A pause. Both of those things are true simultaneously. I find it difficult to fully separate them. She stood at the door. She thought about branches that moved and came back. She thought about the specific weight of choosing. She thought about what it meant to be in the middle of something, and to know you were in the middle, and to stay anyway. One more thing, he said. Still true. She waited. I read your margin notes, he said, for 2 years, and I said nothing, because I was afraid of what honest attention looked like. I know what it looks like now. I intend to practice it. She turned around. She looked at him. Then practice, she said. She went back to her rooms. Owen was awake and had Edna's cat beside him and was looking at the south-facing window with the exact expression of someone making a thorough assessment of the available light, which was considerable and warm and entirely present. She sat at the desk. She opened her document to the correct page. She began to write. Outside the window, the ashen wood was green and enormous, and full of everything it kept, and the palace was old and certain of itself in the way places are when they have not yet been required to change. And in the west wing rooms of it a woman who had once been called a ward and had once been called a pawn, and had walked through a forest and built something from almost nothing and come back on her own terms, was sitting at a desk that was exactly the right size, in a room with south-facing windows, doing the work that was hers. The cat settled. The baby watched the light. She wrote. And in the east corridor, which still had its acoustic fault, which would always have its acoustic fault, which was simply a thing this palace contained the way it contained everything else, old and unalterable, and full of the traces of what had happened inside it, the silence was ordinary. It was just a corridor. She had walked through it. She had walked through it. She had walked through all of them, and now she was here, at the desk, in the light, with the pen moving, and the page filling, and the document becoming what she had decided it would become, which was true, and clear, and entirely on her terms. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.